Well, what a glorious day. We have arrived at the final Sunday in the church calendar. Won't be long now, another week, and we'll be into Advent and rushing off to Christmas. But today, we celebrate the reign of Christ, or as it is known in other parts of the communion, Christ the King Sunday. It is that final day as we gather as a community. The white vestments come out and we celebrate a feast. Yet, as we dig into the readings, it doesn't feel all that celebratory. Old Testament reading about shepherds getting condemned, Jesus hanging on a cross to die. Did we get the readings wrong this morning? Did I put the bulletin together by mistake? I don't know. But it had me thinking a little bit. Had me thinking about a movie that I'm not supposed to enjoy. It had me thinking about a movie that, well, it makes fun of the church a little bit. Some of you may have seen it. It's called Dogma, starring Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. And there's a scene in the movie Dogma that seeks to parody the church a little bit, where the Cardinal Archbishop comes out onto the front stoop of the cathedral to give a press conference to a number of reporters and announces that he gets it already, that the church is becoming irrelevant, and maybe our symbols have to change. And so he announces that the cross will get retired from now on. The crucifix especially, this morbid and deathly image that nobody really wants to see. And so unveils from underneath a curtain, he pulls it away and he says, the new image of our faith will be Buddy Christ. 2 thumbs up and a wink. Make everyone feel real good again. And although they're making fun of us a little bit, I think they parody some truth. That our inclination is to avoid the cross. To say things like, give me the Jesus that makes me feel good. Give me the kind of teachings around things that I can strive for and achieve. Let me come back to the cross in a minute. We start today with the Old Testament reading from the prophet Jeremiah, where he talks about a frustrated God. A God who has seen shepherds who scatter the sheep. And if you think he's just talking about some hypothetical shepherds, you just go a couple chapters earlier, and Jeremiah is naming the kings of his time. The kings who have been anointed and chosen by God, yet they have lusted after power and hoarded the resources for themselves. They have left the widow and the orphan to suffer, and God's had just about enough of them. He has fury at these anointed leaders who have abused their power and left the vulnerable to fend for themselves. And I wonder if he's not frustrated with himself as well. Because he chose them. He anointed them. He set them apart. And so in this chapter, as we do in the prophet Isaiah and from many other prophetic voices in the Old Testament, we hear the first inferences of God declaring that he must first become shepherd and king. We hear those first lines about the root of Jesse and the stem of David, and how a great king, a great shepherd will be called. That God himself must become king. And that's what we celebrate today. That the reign of Christ has begun. That Christ is king, sits upon his throne. But what does that even mean? Last I checked, it's a pretty dark world out there. Just turn on your television. You hear stories about racism, bigotry. I walked down Mount Pleasant the other day, had to rip signs down from lamp poles. Dear white person, join the alt-right movement. Across the city and everywhere. We see stories from Syria and Iraq where children are being pulled out of bombed-out buildings. Not to mention the homelessness and poverty that's right before our eyes in our city. I too often see on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, when bad things happen, people saying, well, God is still king. Christ is Lord. And I wonder if those aren't empty platitudes, if we don't unpack that a little bit. Because if God is king, why doesn't the kingdom look like the king? And I think it has a lot to do with how we understand Christ's kingship and how we understand his kingdom, and maybe even how we read the stories about him. The parts we embrace and the parts where we avert our eyes. As I said, it won't be long, just a month from now, just 5 weeks before we're celebrating Christmas. And I think most of us enjoy that story. We even sentimentalize it and romanticize it a little bit. Beautiful baby Jesus in his golden diapers. Sheep and cattle cooing as they gather around. Shepherds come from the fields to celebrate with them. And the baby, not a cry he makes. We sentimentalize it and romanticize it a little bit, but it's a story that we like. We embrace God becoming a human being. We're okay with that. But what if God becoming king is a harder thing to lay our eyes upon? What if God becoming king looks like a crown of thorns that rip into his scalp? What if the coronation of that king begins with being anointed with spit and vile words? What if his throne is a cross upon which his hands and his feet are nailed? What if Good Friday is the story of what it looks like when God becomes king? Because the world, it's not God's kingdom. At least it's not yet. And Jesus just isn't a worldly king. He's not the kind of king that seeks to raise an army to get justice and peace through violence and war. He might not even be a king we want, because we're so used to the idea of power and might being the way that peace is achieved. But in Jesus' life and death, even before we know him as the risen one, we already see the kingdom breaking in. For on the cross, the forces of darkness and evil sought to prevail against God. And God stopped time in a moment to show us the very nature of the king of our kingdom. A king willing to give his life for the likes of you and me. There was darkness then, and there is darkness now. And if God's purpose was for Jesus or for us to escape an evil world when we die, then yeah, we should just bury our heads, hide, and wait. But if Christ's kingdom has broken the threshold already, if the reign of Christ has begun, then the subjects of God's kingdom must start and continue the work of revealing, embodying, and enthroning the king. What does that look like, you might ask? Well, it looks like Jesus. It looks like his life, and it looks like his death. It looks like loving enemies. It looks like praying for persecutors. It looks like standing with the marginalized and the oppressed. It looks like submitting to God's authority, often sacrificing one's own desire and will. It looks like self-emptying love, acts of grace and mercy, and downward mobility. Frankly, it should look like the church. It should look like you and me. But if you look around and you don't quite see that yet, if you look around the communion and your eyes don't seem to see these things appear, if you look around the world and you don't see the church acting that way, then it might be time we start, because I assure you, the prophet Jeremiah has some words to speak. On the cross, Jesus showed us very difficult reality. He showed us what it looks like in this world when God becomes king. So on this Reign of Christ Sunday, when the white vestments come out and we celebrate the reign of God, we don't avert our eyes from the most difficult part of the story. We don't sentimentalize it or make it subtext. We lift high the cross, and we proclaim Christ crucified. We give glory to our Redeemer and our King. Thanks be to God.